So I'm just going to explain my signal flow here. Now I use Amplitude 5 running Tone-X captures, and this is great, by the way, on its own, but I found, just because, like all guitarists, we're just always trying to make things better and different, that even though Amplitude 5 has a full raft of stuff to deal with the signal after the amp, there's a couple of other plugins in IK Multimedia's universe that are actually very, very useful for getting a great guitar sound, and being able to run them as well as Amplitude 5 has been absolutely fantastic. Plus there are plugins from other manufacturers that are also very useful. Anyway, we'll go back here for a moment. So at the very top we have our audio interface. I use the XIO, and channel 1 is hitting Amplitude 5. You can also wire it in stereo, but there's no need to do that for Amplitude 5. It's expecting a mono signal from a guitar generally. And then you'll see that I have it going into an audio mixer. And that was more just to split the left and right output of Amplitude 5 into two different sets of left and right outputs. And if you go down the bottom, see there's the audio out for the XIO, but I have this thing, it's a global rack space, and this, dear viewer, is where the magic happens, for me anyway, at least. So that's one unit preset, but see this little globe icon up here? If I click this, I get like what's like a master out. Now, generally when I've been talking about the floorboard effects like Tone Master Pro, Quad Cortex, Helix and all that type of stuff, my bugbear with all of them really is that the master output section is kind of insufficiently useful, or what's the word? It's not very useful, sorry, just for live work and probably even studio work, if truth be told. And the reason for that is they all just have an EQ at the end of the train. And if you go into any forum or discussion group on Facebook about these things, you'll see a lot of complaints that people get related to the Fletcher-Munson curve. So in other words, you get your Quad Cortex or whichever unit you use, you'll set up a great sound at home, you take that to rehearsal and you put it up loud or at a gig and it'll sound entirely different. And that's because, and I keep talking about this, but just for anyone that hasn't heard me waffle about this before, is the way we perceive sound changes proportionate to how much louder it gets. So in other words, the sound gets louder as your tone gets louder, the highs become exaggerated, the upper mids become exaggerated, and the very low end gets exaggerated. And you have to change that. So that's why the first piece of advice a lot of people on YouTube will give you with any digital rig is set your tones at the volume in which you use them. Now, I would argue that there's a bit more to it than that, because when you get into it, you get people saying, well, look, just put a T-shape EQ on it. So in other words, pull off all the low ends and slope out the high end. But that doesn't always work. Actually, most of the time it doesn't work. And the reason for that is that some guitar tones are just really complex. Now, I'm going after Brian May's tone, which is a normal channel of a Vox AC30 being smashed by a treble booster. And it has a very rich high end. Now, I'll just show you my live sound here. You know, so it has a sparkly clean with the guitar volume down, and as I bring it up, sort of a nice gainy but clear sort of sound, and as it opens up fully, probably too much delay there, but you get the idea. It's got a lot of sound that is in a lot of detail in the high end. So if I was to just go, oh right, this is really screechy in my ears at the gig, and just swoop out all the high end, I'd lose a lot of how this thing works. Plus, if you are monitoring with speakers on stage, a big part of what you enjoy about the guitar is how the pickups of the guitar are interacting with a guitar speaker. And this is what a lot of people would often describe as amp in the room feel. Now, obviously there's a different type of thing which is to do with the physics of a big speaker and all of that, and the sound and how we perceive that. But also a big part of that is that, you know, most pickups, when you put them in front of a speaker or near a speaker making the same sound, they'll pick up the sound you already made. And this causes something that's like another type of cascading overdrive effect. And that can lead to a type of feedback. Okay, waffle over. Just applying an EQ at the end of a chain is sometimes just not enough. And you can get, like the Helix has an amazing EQ, where you can actually just find the problematic frequencies and notch them down a bit. And that's a good way of dealing with things. But what I like to do, and I discussed this in the last video, is ask the question, what would an actual guitar amp do? And the answer to that is, like, the speaker on your actual guitar amp would start cutting frequencies in a very soft way, but compressing them rather than notching them out. Because once that information is taken away, it's just gone forever. So in other words, your speakers on your real guitar amp it's a bit like a compressor or a limiter, you know, that's got a very soft knee to it. So it means that those frequencies are still there, so that they're shoved down in a particular way and at a particular speed. And what's great about this approach that I have here in front of you, and I'll just take you through it, is that I can actually do that dynamically. So in other words, instead of just putting a normal compressor at the end of the chain, which you could do, which can get you somewhere there, I look at the end of the audio frequency spectrum where a guitar speaker works. So in other words, there's no super high end being pushed through that guitar speaker. It starts to squash that down as a compressor. The bit in the middle, yeah, broadly intact. The very low end can get a bit of a push as well, but it's about the high end just being pushed down itself as opposed to the whole broad length of the signal. Right, he's off. Let's have a look. Now, so my original guitar tone has been fed into this universe, and the first thing that I have is an equalizer, and I have applied a lot of the sub bass has been removed. I have a little dip about 1 to 200 hertz. I found that's just where it loses a bit of definition as a sound, so I just do that anyway. I could have done that in Amplitude. I probably should have done it in Amplitude. We like to hear sounds where the mid sort of decreases. That's just a psychological thing. I don't know what the reason for it is. So I actually have a very slight dip in the mid, as you can see here. And I have a little dip in the high end where I feel that there is shrillness, which is between 3 and 5K. So it's a nice soft shape. So let's have a look what happens next. So I have two other plugins that follow it, a quad compressor and a quad limiter. And to do slightly different things, similar in some ways and not in others. So this is a compressor, but it's a compressor being applied on the mid and the shrillness of the high end and the very high end. So if you look at this frequencies I'm working at here, that's between 2 and 5 and a bit K. And it's just squashing in the bit that's just a bit sharp, but not getting rid of it, just dynamically pushing it down. So in other words, when the coin that I use is a plectrum, or the plectrum that you might use if you're a real normal guitarist, when I hit a note, the transient sound, the screech that you hear that you mightn't want to hear is that, you know, making contact with the string. And what happens is when that starts to peak in the sound, this compressor just finds that frequency and just pushes it down so it's not, you know, making that unpleasant sound. And this is what an amplifier would do. Anyway, the limiter is doing something similar. I tend to work them together, but just slightly different. So this limiter is only working on the low end and that same frequency again, and it's just a security device just in case I do something a little bit too hard with the plectrum and I need to really brick wall it a bit. And then finally, I have the option of reverb. Now, just to explain, oh, excuse me, bring it back. I don't use reverb on stage. I use delay instead. So you'll hear a lot of delay in this signal, but that's only because the speakers that I use to monitor on stage, they're just very close to my face. You know, they're just on the floor pointing up at me. So I could use reverb, but I like to use delay, and it just gives it a little bit more of a sense of space for the guitar, and it's not as harsh when it's come back at you that way. Plus, I think on the live recordings of Queen, there is a little bit of that anyway when they remix them for professional releases. It does give it a bit more of a hi-fi sheen. But anyway, I don't use reverb because I find reverb clouds things out. But why do I have it in the chain? It's just for when I'm at home. So I might like to use my live sound at home, but I might want to simulate a bit what it's like on stage. So I can just throw that on, stick it in a live room, and it's just a nice little thing to have, you know. So I just leave it there for those type of moments. Or sometimes I'm in a rehearsal studio that's very small and it just gives you a bit more of a sense of space. And that's really it.